X1 testnet up and running. We call it Solana. 66 nodes. Synchronizing all the world transactions at the speed of light. Now, if you're not red-pilled by Anatoly Yakovenko's vision, there's something wrong, okay? Network ping, 1149 milliseconds. The leaders are rotating, the leader schedules, and here we can see all the degenerate validators on the testnet. New from Mr. Leo is that we per validator can see the ping data. Most interesting is the median. Very good, Mr. Leo, keep on keyboarding. We are finding bugs, we're fixing bugs. We're doing optimizations, we're doing modifications. We're getting ready for X1 mainnet. Okay, LFG. If you want to join X1 Solana testnet, go to docs.x1.xyz and learn how to become a validator. There's tutorials, there's step-by-steps. First you create a read-only node, then you create a validator node. It's very simple, it's very straightforward. If you need help, you go to community in a Telegram group and we will help you. It's time to start preparing now. There's 10 million reasons why you should, which will be evident by this video, which will be very interesting, so watch until the end. Okay, let's dive right in, guys. Now, given the tech, this is all about the financial flows, incentives, and how you can be part of the chain core infrastructure and potentially create a lot of value for yourself from it by participating in this network. So I've tried to break this down so everyone can follow along by removing all of the tech aspects and focus more on how all the financial flows relate to one another. So we will look at Validator Financials, where we overview the process, the key differentiators we will make for X1 after analyzing Solana that are most relevant to you as a validator. We will also look at the leader schedule criteria, the selection to become a leader, the fee distribution, and then we will talk a little bit about how we can bootstrap this network to a very large network in a very short amount of time. And nothing of this is, of course, financial advice or any promises whatsoever. Promises are for Girl Scouts, so put your big boy pants on, otherwise you are naked. So let's first get an overview over the financials of being a validator on Solana. So as a validator, you're running your node, and for that you need a server. So you're paying a hosting provider for the server. What you're also paying is voting costs. So you pay 1 sol per day per validator in voting costs. 50% of these voting costs they burn, so that's a deflationary mechanism, and 50% goes to this imaginary block rewards bucket. And why are you paying these voting costs? Well, you're paying these voting costs because you're also performing voting on the blocks that the leader has been producing. So all the RPCs are forwarding the client's transactions to the for the moment leader, who can then propagate and execute these transactions. For this work, you are getting paid by inflation. So on Solana, they have a built-in inflation mechanism that started at Genesis at 8% with a disinflationary rate of 15%. So each year, this 8% is reduced by 15%. And then it targets a long-term inflation rate of 1.5%. So voting rewards are paid by inflation. And how that works is that throughout an epoch, validators accumulate credits from voting, which they can then exchange for a share of the inflation at the end of the epoch. So the total inflation pot is first divided based on credits earned for the epoch, and a validator's share of the total credits, their credits divided by the sum of all validators' credits, determines their proportional reward. And this is then further weighted by stake. So how much you stake in relation to the total stake. And if you run a good node with good metrics, you can also attract delegators to your validator. So that's basically how staking works on Solana. You delegate with a delegated proof of stake to a validator. And you as a validator can then choose whatever commission you want for that delegation. So this delegation commission should also actually be here on the revenue side. Also on the revenue side, and relevant for you as a validator, is of course when users are using the chain. So this is you, this is your mom, this is Alice, this is Bob, this is anyone who wants to use the chain. They have to pay a mandatory base fee and a voluntary priority fee, which we collectively can call transaction fees. And these transaction fees are then distributed to block rewards and burn deflation. So 50% of the base fee goes to block rewards bucket and 50% goes to burn deflation, and 100% of the priority fee goes to the block rewards. So in effect, we have a mechanism for deflation both on the revenue side and the cost side, and we have a mechanism for inflation. So collectively, we have mechanism that can build an economy around this. So who gets these block rewards? Well, the leader gets the block rewards because he's building the blocks. And who can be leader? The leader is determined by the leader schedule, which in turn is determined by stake weight solely on Solana. So if you have a stake weight of 1%, meaning that you stake 1% of the total stake on the network, then you are selected as a leader 1% of the time. And if you then successfully build the blocks that are voted on by the rest of the validator cluster, you get these block rewards. So what I want you to take away from this overview is basically that you have a cost side and a revenue side. Now, if we clean this up, it will look like this. On the cost side, you have the server cost and you have the voting costs as a validator. And on the revenue side, you have voting rewards from inflation. You get commission from your delegators, and you have block rewards from block production when you successfully create blocks and they are approved by consensus. So if you think of this like a little business, and in any business, you want to minimize the cost and you want to maximize the revenue, of course, but it's not so in reality, because if you have the wrong incentive structure on all of these factors, you can end up in a network that's more centralized and that has an unnecessary redistribution of wealth, which I will talk about a little bit later. So we consider all of these things now so we can make a validator set which is as profitable as possible for as many validators as possible. And then we can get a big network which is good for adoption, which is good for decentralization, which is good for security and censorship resistance, and ultimately value of the X1 blockchain. Now, Base and Arbitrum and other L2 networks like that, there's no value in the validator network. They're running the whole show on one node. In relation to Solana, if we can somehow make a validator set that's twice the size of Solana, where most are also profitable, then we have to ask ourselves, what's the value of that? So I think that's a very valid KPI to strive for. The validator network is the heart of the chain. The validator set, you can see it as a network of mini businesses. If we can make them profitable, we can also demand that they run good infrastructure and good network, and that's good for the chain. So that's basically how Solana works. And now I will tell you the differences that we are going to make for X1 primarily. So the first thing we're going to change is how we are calculating the base fee. So right now on Solana, they charge a base fee of 5,000 lamports per signature. The problem with that is that the base fee is not dynamic and doesn't take into consideration how much compute you use. And this is basically what we proved with Solsen. Because with Solsen since launch, we have occupied Solana's entire chain, their entire block space, with between 10 to 30%. And the reason we can do that is basically what we have proven is that you can take huge amount of compute without basically paying a lot for it at all. And our solution to that is something we call congestion reflective dynamic base fees. But that's a whole science in itself, and I'm going to make a separate video about all of that because I need to take you deep down in the Lamport matrix for you guys to get the full picture of how that will work. But that's very interesting. But for now, what we're going to focus on is more low-hanging fruit changes that we're going to make. For instance, we're going to change the distribution of these transaction fees between block rewards and burn deflation. We're also going to change the leader schedule criteria from stake weight to something else. So the methodology that we have going into this is to identify the weak points of the system and then make the minimal adjustments that we can make that will have the hugest effect. And the thing that will have the biggest effect on this network is to remove the voting costs completely. And I will explain to you why. So if we dissect the voting cost that you pay in Solana today, so how many blocks per day do you have to vote on? That's 216,000, because if you take 86,400 seconds times 2.5 and 2.5 because there's 400 millisecond slots in 1 second, and we assume that it's one block per slot. And the signatures per vote is 1. So that means that the votes per day per validator is then 216,000. So the fee per signature is 5,000 Lamports, which equals that the vote fees per day per validator amounts to 1.80 Sol. So the vote fees per day per validator in US American dollars is $150. And if we take that for a month, that's $4,500 per validator per month. And in a year, that amounts to $54,000. And if we then multiply that with the whole validator cluster of currently 1,377 paying validators, that amounts to per year to $74 million. Now, 50% of the voting cost, as we already stated, goes to burn. So that's awesome for deflation and token value. But the problem is that it's at the expense of the most important human being in the world, which is the chain's validators. And 50% goes to the block rewards bucket, so the leaders. Now, considering the fact that the top 100 validators of Solana have a weighted stake of 73.6%, that amounts to 27 million per year only to them. So in effect, you have a redistribution of wealth, 1,377 validators to 100 validators per year just from votes. And remember that block rewards include all fees. So there's also voting, but also transaction fees. Now, to be fair, it's not 100 entities that cash in on this. These validators also have thousands of delegators who share the pie. But it would be interesting to dissect these numbers further and find out exactly how many delegators there are per top 100 validators. I'm looking at you, Joseph. But nonetheless, this feels very suboptimal. Now, the problem with Solana is that it's very difficult to scale the validator set. It's very expensive to join. Most validators are not profitable. And for that reason, it creates a very high barrier to entry. And one reason for that is that you have to pay for the votes as a validator. So you pay for each vote, which amounts to 1 Sol per day and which amounts to 54,000 per year. And initially, when it was introduced, the Sol price was very low. But now it's a $70 billion protocol and it's starting to get quite high. The question is, why do you have to pay for votes in the first place? And sort of philosophically, Tolly basically says that if we have the best network, validators should also use it. And if they use it, weighted votes do consume compute units, 2,100 per vote, and therefore they should also pay. But in response to that, we think that every vote is net positive for the network and not net negative. And if you have no votes, then you have no network. So an increase in votes make the network more resilient. Therefore, we shouldn't punish it. Votes go to the leaders. It's positive for the whales, not the network. Well, yes, the token price due to the 50% deflation, but again, it's at the expense of the many validators. So whatever deflationary pressure that has come from Solana the last couple of years, that has come from the many validators, since transaction fees really hasn't come to the network until lately. And again, that's good for price, but it's at a cost. And the cost has been from the thousands of validators paying 1 Sol per day to serve the network, while the fees in terms of block rewards, the leader schedule netted was 0 and a lot above. Now, technically, you can also make the argument that paying for votes deters spam. And the idea there is that if votes are free, then people will spam votes and that will affect consensus. But there's no incentive to spam with votes. There's like zero incentive. Because someone could do it now on Solana as well, maliciously. You just pay 1 Sol per day and it just takes 50 minutes to do an attack and you don't have to pay that much. However, the votes are still weighted on stake to count. So if you're malicious, you still need to grab a large stake in order to vote maliciously for that to have any effect at all. And you need to stake more than 33% of the total stake. And its total stake right now is like $60 billion. So a third of that is a lot of money. It's more than I have invested in meme coins right now, I can tell you that much. But you can still attack by spamming a leader or an RPC with whatever spam, not votes, doesn't have to be votes. But if you pay for votes or not, doesn't hinder that fact. So then the question is, can we technically actually remove the voting costs? Technically, Yes, we can. Jack's been deep in the matrix and figured out how. So it actually works. We have a cluster to base that fact on of 4 nodes right now that we are running, and we're soon to introduce it to the whole validator cluster. We need to do a bit more testing, but it looks very promising, because if we can remove the voting cost for the validators, then we're reducing cost drastically to run the network, and we can achieve much higher scalability of the validator set. So we lower the barriers to become a validator and make every validator much more profitable. And thus we reduce the necessity to tax the system of the cost side of the APY directed towards the validator set. And as Tolly says, anything above 0 is a tax on the user. In this case, the user is the validator. Important to mention technically also, if you're interested, is that votes go in a separate thread. So you have 4 threads for the execution of the transactions, and then you have 2 separate threads for votes. So votes are not hindered by congestion in the execution threads, but they still do compute. So they have 2,100 compute units per vote. So they still compete for global compute unit limit of 48 million. And if blocks are full, votes can be pushed out on Solana today. And we saw that with Solsen. So there were, for example, 63 votes in one block. And weighted stake says that it must be at least 2/3, so 67%, which is way more. I don't know exactly right now, but it's way more than 63 votes. But that's fine because it doesn't crash the network. The block just won't be voted on until a bit later, before considered confirmed. So anyway, we can delay consensus with at least 1 block, which is not optimal, of course. But this will not be a problem at all for us, because when we also implement congestion reflective dynamic base fees, because then the block will never be full. So there's no risk in any circumstance for votes to be pushed off. Well, technically, they can be full, but since the base fee will be dynamic, it will be like extremely expensive to fill the whole block. So all in all, this is a huge differentiator that X1 will have in relation to Solana, and we're very, very close to having it done. So we will have it done for sure before X1 launches. Now, moving on. So if we clean up this picture a bit, then it will look like this for X1. So here we removed the voting costs for the validator, and we also modified the leader schedule criteria and added some other stuff, which I will talk about next. And we are also going to talk about the distribution of the transaction fees. We see no reason today to modify the Solana inflation schedule, which starts at 8%. It has a disinflation rate of 15% per year, and it targets a long-term inflation by 1.5%. And that's pretty good. I think we should just stick to that. We shouldn't fix anything that's not broken. So now let's do a step-by-step comparison of being a validator on Solana versus X1. Let's look at the monthly validator cost and compare that to the revenue of voting inflation, excluding potential block rewards. So to run a validator on Solana, you need a beefy server, and you pay about $500 per month. Initially for X1, the server requirements will be way lower. So you can get a really good server for about $150 per month. And this is simply because we will have way less traffic on the network naturally. Eventually, the validator requirements will likely increase also for X1, but then validators will make revenue and can more easily afford a $500 server per month. But as we have pointed out, the voting costs on Solana amounts to $4,500 per month at the current prices of Sol versus dollars. But the voting costs, since we removed them, will be 0 for X1. So we have $5,000 per month for running a validator on Solana versus $150 per month in comparison, which is, of course, very significant. So if we now factor in the monthly validator voting revenue, the current voting APY on Solana is 7.25%. I know that APY is not the same as APR, but I'm too lazy to make the exact calculation here. So it's roughly the same. And there's other factors that are varying this APY today on Solana. The native staking yield is more currently like 6.3%. And depending on the validator performance and commission, of course. But there's other factors that affect this APY. Like if you stake with Helium, for example, they take 0% commission, but you can also stake through services like Marinade, who optimize by altering the allocation of your delegated stake based on the validator's performance. You can also get additional staking incentives through liquid staking, etc. You can also stake through Giro, and then you get extra MAV yields, etc. But just to make it simple, let's say it's 7.25% for this calculation. Now, to make revenue match up with cost, you will need to stake around $830,000 at a minimum stake for break even to make enough revenue from inflation to pay for your infrastructure costs, which is a lot. So if we, for example, stake 7.25% for X1, just for comparison, the equivalent stake needed for break even would be $25,000. And that's a reduction of 97% in minimum stake for break even. And this is just to show you the unlocked potential that we are sitting on. The huge effect these voting costs have for the single validator and eventually the whole system. So there's a lot at stake to remove the necessity to stake, so to speak. So the question for us then, how do we make the validator make more than $25,000 per year to fund his infrastructure? And our inflation will, of course, initially be higher than 7.25%, of course. But we will also, added to this, incentivize the living hell out of it. And that's just a cliffhanger if you want to stay a little longer in this video. So let's move on and let's look at this leader schedule criteria. Now, what we'll do for X1, where Solana has a leader schedule criteria which is solely stake weight, we will make a combination of stake weight, performance, and randomness. So if we begin with stake. Now, stake weight is good to have because it ensures safety and it discourses away malicious attempts to take down the network. Stake weight also, of course, creates utility for the token. It's the number one DeFi for the chain. So stake and earn yield. And we want people to buy the token, and they must be incentivized to do so. By stake being included, there's also protocols like Marinade or Giro likewise who can optimize your delegated stake yield based on validator performance or include MEV extraction as a factor and stuff like that. But we will also add performance, which is something that Solana does not enforce today. It's a low-hanging fruit of enforcement to the validators. Make sure your node has adequate uptime and doesn't skip slots, like no matter how much you stake. And I think the assumption from Solana was that the financial incentives would be enough for people to make sure that your node doesn't skip slots. But it obviously doesn't work optimally. Some validators at times have a lot of skipped slots, but also a high stake weight. So if you have X% skipped slots, that means in reality that X% of the time they are selected as leaders, and X% of the time you as a user will get a failed transaction. Some validators at time have a lot of skipped slots, but also a high stake weight. So if you have X% skipped slots, that means in reality that X% of the time they are selected as leaders. X% of the time you as a user will get a failed or rather delayed transaction X% of the time, since it tries for 150 slots before it is rejected. So another leader might pick it up. It's likely it won't be rejected then, but you have this optimized system for 400 milliseconds. There's no reason not to enforce performance on the validator. So low performance will reduce your selection. And we will also include randomness, because what we do want is have a widely decentralized validator network, validator set. What we don't want is to end up with a centralized cabal that takes all the block rewards in the long run. So as long as you qualify in terms of performance, you will end up on the leader schedule. If not adequate performance, you're not allowed into Berghain. Sven says no. How much you then get to produce the block while on the leader schedule will then be a combination of stake weight and randomness. Because the danger with leader selection solely dependent on stake weight is that it can lead to centralization. So to combat that in the long run, we slowly increase the randomness randomness as a selector. Ethereum does it today, actually, for block proposers. So the system will choose leaders based on an algorithm at random to be chosen as a leader. And that will democratize the validator set. It allows for new validators to join and have a chance to earn block rewards. So the strategy here is basically to get in and make a few whales and fuck them over later for decentralization's sake. So that's you. Because we don't want 75% of the whole network stake by only 100 validators. And since we're starting, it's okay to have it for a while as more people join. So we start with stake weight being very high. And then as time progresses, randomness increases in significance. So it's a more toppy normal distribution at first that we then like flatten down to make it more decentralized with time. So to boost staking incentive, we might start with a very high weight on stake weight and then to be phased out in favor of randomness. So we will create a leaderboard where you can see your validator metrics in terms of performance, in terms of stake weight, and how that relates to score. The most important thing here is that low performance reduces your selection. So low performance reduces your stake weight score, and if performance starts to suffer, my stake weight starts to suffer. So not your actual stake, but the counted weight that it carries. And we think that this modification of having this leader schedule criteria based on both stake and performance, stake weight, performance, and randomness is crucial for not bottlenecking the validator scalability in the long run with 100%. So now let's also look at the distribution of transaction fees. And it will look like something like this. So what Solana is that they distribute 50% of the base fee to burns for deflation and 50% of the leader, and the priority fee goes 100% to the leader. And recently changed the priority fee from being 50% burn, 50% leader to 100% leader, which is a bit strange because it furthers the leader's block rewards versus deflation, but I don't actually claim perfect knowledge of that decision. Now for X1, we counterintuitively to everything we talked about, basically think that 100% of the base fee should go to the leader and 100% of the priority as well should go to the leader. And why do we think so? Because but that's just initially. So let's say the first 2 or 3 years, both base fee and priority fee goes to the leader. Because at least initially, it's better to give the leaders yield than to have a marginal deflation. Because inflation will be massive anyway. So the deflation will basically not have an effect because the transaction fees will be low anyway. So that's how we think. Let me know what you guys think about that. And we also haven't finished the builder incentives yet, which we're going to take care of very, very soon. We could potentially also implement part of the fees to protocol builders, as we discussed a year ago. Sonic, previous Phantoms, seems to be implementing this, apart from also implementing a business license to their database, which per definition makes them non-open source anymore, but that's another discussion. So let me know what you guys think of that. It's not a biggie. We can, when the chain is live, also alter this distribution depending on how it goes. And all these distribution are, again, it's just a weighing of the validator incentives versus the desired deflation. So it's nothing major, at least initially. You want more rewards, but you also want the coin to pump the fuck up. So it's something to think about at least. So now what I'm explaining here in Validator Financials is basically just the economic flows of how everything affects everything else. But for you as an individual validator, this business is very simple. So just make sure that you have a good server, make sure it stays up and have good performance. That's basically it. You only have to think about the server costs on the cost side. And we removed the voting costs, so there's nothing to worry about cost-wise. So you can buy more flowers to your wife with the money you save or something like that. And on the revenue side, it's much more sexy because you're collecting voting rewards from inflation. So there's less APY needed from the system since there's no voting cost, but we're going to keep the inflation schedule, so it's going to be Christmas. And if you have good performance and if you're a good marketer, you can also attract delegators to your validator and earn a commission of that. So that's also a source of income to your validator. And and on top of that, you can also earn block rewards on top of that from transaction fees. So every time the chain has usage, you want to make sure you stake a shit ton because you get a shit ton of that proportional reward from the block rewards. So we democratize the leader schedule and have more inclusion for the leader schedule so we can make more money for more validators. So if you think of this like a little business, it's pretty good business, right? Because you have a startup cost of zero, basically. You have a startup cost of zero. You have a server cost of $150 per month. You have free education. You have a validator cluster that will help you in the validator chat with everything that you're struggling with. And you're basically earning revenue from day one. So it's pretty good. And on top of that, you will also get a Bootstrap bonus. You will also get a Bootstrap bonus because you want to hear this, Marask and Owl and Crypto Bra and Og and Tricity West and Snowman and Mr. Dingo and Marzinex and Zen Artists and Mr. Leo and Joseph and all you degenerate validators, because you're going to love this. So let's finish off this stream and talk about the Bootstrap bonus. So now let's talk about how the Bootstrap bonus comes in with the Validator Bootstrap program. Now, the question is, if we have the conditions set for a big validator network, how can we actually make sure that we get it and get it fast? So what we do is that we incentivize the shit out of it, of course, and creating this validator bootstrap program, and we leverage inflation to do so. So basically what we do, we gamify the validator creation, just like we have with SandBlocks. So with SandBlocks, we have this schedule of fixed number of blocks being available to mine every day, every hour, every second. And if I'm the only miner, that's awesome because now I'm getting all the blocks. But if you also come as a miner, well, now we're sharing the blocks weighted on hash rate in the SandBlocks case. So we share it like bros. And here it's the same concept, but instead of blocks, we create this pool with the native gas token, and we allocate 10 million. It can be 1 million, it can be 20 million. I'm just saying something for example's sake. Okay, but in each case, we're gonna make it juicy AF. At least for this validator incentive bootstrap program to get your bootstrap bonus. And at least it will be higher than the 8% inflation APY, like way higher. Because the validators are, again, they're the most important human being on the chain. They do all the work and they validate all the transactions. They answer all the questions. And they're making sure that we can have lightning fast execution. So they need to be heavily incentivized. So if I'm the only validator on X1, how this works with this pool is that I get for 1 year of validating all of this boosted yield, which create an incentive for you to come in and become the validator too. And then we share this pool and so on. So how we design this is basically, let's say we have a KPI of 5,000 validators after 1 year, like that's the target. So when we calculate the rewards, we factor in the cost of a server for 1 year, we factor in voting rewards from inflation that you already get, we factor in block rewards, which will be very, very low the first year. But then on top of that, we give our validators this boosted yield on top, paid by the treasury. So a big bag of cash money, baby, just come and get it, get a server, get adequate performance, become an X1 validator and get boosted yield. If you can afford it, well, create another validator then. The incentive for you to do so is there, especially in the beginning. You are taking a risk in cost to be considerate about. You're paying a fiat and you get a native token that might be worth zero. So factor that in. You will also, in order to be rewarded, be required to have adequate performance. So you will need to manage your node very, very well. And it's hard to do so with more and more servers, of course. But if you put in the work, you're also rewarded by this program. And this way we can get a huge validator network, maybe even bigger than Solana, where all or most are profitable within a year. Let's see how it goes. But if we have a huge network, which is the goal, that creates a lot of value for the chain and every stakeholder holding and staking our token. And we can test our network strength with the tech in a very decentralized network. So the low-level FUD will be, oh, Cornelio, one validator, one server. But to be honest, who gives a shit? Because you are one person, you're paying for 2 servers, you do twice the work, you're paying for twice the infrastructure, you're paying for the network build-out. So just shut the fuck up and take the money. So not only are we not charging you for votes, we're also paying you to be a validator with this Bootstrap yield. So it's a pretty good setup, we think. And we're not going to KYC the validators. I don't want to see your ugly face on an ID. It's enough to see your profile picture every day. And you occasionally, from time to time, have to see my ugly face. I'm sorry about that, which is unfortunate. But we are working on the details of this validator Bootstrap program right now. So share your feedback, stay tuned, stay buff. But now, guys, it's high time for you to start learning how to become a validator so you miss out not on this program from the Genesis and the Bootstrap bonus. Because the earlier you are, you also have to consider that you are making more, since there's going to be less validators sharing the pool. And as time goes on, more and more validators will join, and then more are sharing the pool, of course. So what you do is go to docs.x1.xyz, which I talked about in the beginning, and follow the steps to learn how to become a validator. If you just determined, you will easily be able to do it. And we will create a leaderboard also with uptime, skipped slots, and votes produced, or sync with Mr. Leo, who made x1val.online. So yes, that's basically it. Share your feedback, and LFG.